Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another week in this course on the Civil War and Reconstruction. It is week 4, I believe it is. This week we are talking about the initial battles between the Union and the Confederacy. Last week we talked a bit about the secession crisis, the justifications that Southerners used for seceding, the reasons that they wanted to secede, and what they told the world as to why they were seceding, which of course was slavery, with a little bit of states' rights kind of sprinkled in here and there. But it was slavery was the reason that this war began. So we talked about that. We talked about Lincoln's response to the secession crisis, his response to all those arguments about secession and the North being evil and all of that. And then we talked about the first shots that were fired at the, I don't know if you want to call it a battle of Fort Sumter, but the barrage of Fort Sumter, the attack on Fort Sumter, whatever you want to call it. It was the first shots fired of the Civil War. And so, now, where we pick up today, the shooting has started. The war is on. And so what we're going to talk about here today is it's going to be a fairly short video, but I want to just talk about some of the advantages that both sides bring to the conflict. Because the two sides, they had some differences. They were not evenly matched in any way. And so we're going to talk about that here today. So I'm going to talk about the advantages that both sides bring to the table, but for the most part, everything I'm going to be talking about here is Union advantages. The Union dominated the resources of the country, as these two tables here show. The Union, most of the population of the United States lived in free states. The vast majority of factory production, 91% of the country's factory production, was in the northern states, in the Union states. 71% of railroad mileage was in the Union. Only 29-30% were in the Confederacy. We've got a little bit of a discrepancy between these two charts here. Railroads are 70% for Union here, but only 71% there. Let's not get too bogged down in the details about that kind of thing, but let's focus on just kind of the big picture. The Confederacy is at a loss on most of these criteria here. Total population, factory production, railroad mileage, iron production, farm acreage, wheat production, wealth produced. Over here, we've got possibly some surprising numbers. I mean, the factories, we're talking 110,000 factories existing in the northern states versus only 18,000 in the south. That shouldn't be too surprising, because of course the Southerners were producing cotton, as we can see down here. 96% of the country's cotton supply came from the South. And so the South was supplying the raw resources, which was being shipped up north, and the factories in the north were converting those raw resources into finished goods. So it shouldn't be a surprise that more factories exist in the north than in the south. And that brings us to the first spot here, where it actually looks like the Confederacy has a bit of an advantage here when we're talking about this kind of overall overarching view of advantages and disadvantages. The Southerners had 96% of the nation's cotton production. And before the war, it had been assumed that that was going to be an asset for the South. Some of you mentioned in the discussion boards, Hammond, I'm drawing a blank on his first name for some, John Henry Hammond, I hope. Anyway, Hammond had made the famous proclamation that cotton is king. The American economy depends on cotton, and so because of that, Southerners and their slave system were untouchable from the perspective of Southerners. Because if there was a problem, Southerners could then sell all that cotton to the rest of the world, make a whole lot of money, buy all the weapons they would need, and be able to defend themselves against any kind of Union attack or attack on slavery or anything like that. The problem, though, is that while this had seemed like it would be an advantage before the war, during the war it became very apparent that this is not an advantage in any way. Because the first thing the Union did, as we will see in a few minutes, was build a naval blockade around the southern ports so that nothing could come in or out. Now, there was some smuggling, and so some stuff got in and out, but for the most part, most of that cotton that was produced by southern states just sat on wharfs and in warehouses and just rotted during the war. It did not turn into any kind of advantage, because the problem with cotton is that if you can't sell it, there's not much else you can do with it during wartime. You can't eat it, and you can't shoot people with it. I mean, you can try, but if I'm going to get shot, I guess I want it to be done by a cotton bullet. But the cotton isn't going to do you any good. And so Southerners created this massive supply of cotton, but couldn't do anything with it. And unfortunately for the Southerners, as we've been talking about all along, they had devoted most of their economy to cultivating cash crops like cotton. So as we can see here, they had not invested in things like wheat. They had not invested in farm acreage. They had invested in cotton plantations. And when push came to shove, Northerners have all kinds of food to eat. They've got the wheat, they've got the farms, they've got all kinds of fruits, vegetables, and all that great stuff that people need to survive. Southerners did not. Southerners had a whole lot of cotton, which was pretty much useless to them. So, cotton turned out to not be king after all. And incidentally, on the world stage, what happened during the Civil War was that, okay, so the American cotton supply got cut off to the rest of the world. Guess what the rest of the world did? They just started growing cotton around the world. And so the British Empire, for example, turned much of India into a massive cotton plantation. So that by the time the war was over, the world cotton supply actually hadn't changed one bit. It's just that it was all coming from different places now. It wasn't coming from the U.S. anymore. So that's going to be a problem. When we talk about the end of the war, that's going to be a huge problem too, because when the when the war is over and the American South starts to produce and ship cotton again, they're going to run into a worldwide glut of cotton because everybody is producing cotton at that point, and so the price of cotton is going to tank. The only other thing on this chart, down at the very bottom here, that makes it look like the Southerners have an advantage here is freedmen in military service. But this is misleading, because what this is saying is that of the total number of forces that were committed in the war, the Union only had to supply 25% of their fighting age young men to the war effort. The Confederacy had to devote 75% of their young military age men to the war effort, which means in the North, 75% of fighting age young men were left behind to do other cool things, like build things, like, build railroads, build houses, build farms. The Union was able to continue to improve its infrastructure during the war because they did not have to dedicate all that much of their manpower to the war effort. Southerners, on the other hand, had to dedicate almost all of their military age young men to the military effort, which means nothing's getting done back home. They're not building railroads. They're not, creating an independent nation. They don't have the manpower to build a self-sufficient wheat supply or anything like that. So this actually is another thing that on paper might look good for Southerners, but it actually is not. This is demonstrating one of the serious problems that Southerners have. Some other kind of random stuff. Textiles shouldn't be surprising. That's because the factories were in the North, and so there was a 17-to-1 ratio of the amount of textiles available to the North versus the South, which is why throughout the war there are going to be Confederate soldiers wandering from battlefield to battlefield without any shoes, without any established uniform. A lot of Confederate soldiers basically wear whatever they wore when they left the house, and they're going to just wear that for the duration of the conflict. There are very few Confederate soldiers that actually have full-on uniforms. The officers do, but the foot soldiers, they don't. And that's one of the things that, Union soldiers will make fun of them for, because Union soldiers are going to have these beautiful, fresh uniforms to wear to battle. Confederates are just going to be wearing whatever they left the house in. So that's a problem. Possibly another surprising development is that the vast majority of guns, firearms, in the United States existed in Union states, not in the South. Part of that is population distribution, but also a huge part of that is that Southerners actually didn't like having very many guns around because they're always terrified of what happens if slaves get a hold of guns. That could be very messy. If suddenly slaves find a cache of weapons, who knows what they'll do with it. So despite all of our preconceptions about Southerners having duels over honor and Southerners and their hunting and their self-sufficiency and all of that. The reality is that actually relatively few guns existed in the South. The vast majority of them were in northern states. So, in every way here, the Union has advantages in every way over the South. But it doesn't stop there. I mean, we talked before about population. Just to give you a sense, we've talked about how this North and the South diverged over time. Here's another way that they diverged. Back in 1800, free states and slave states had almost the exact same population, so they were evenly balanced. That Missouri Compromise, when they had the number of free states and slave states was balanced, the population was also balanced. By 1860, though, that balance is no longer balanced. In the free states, we've got almost 19 million people living in those free states, and only 12 million people living in those slave states. And to further complicate it, a third of the population of slave states were slaves, which means that there were white Southerners outnumbered slaves 2-to-1, which, okay, that's in some ways might seem like an advantage. However, if you've got a population of 4 million slaves back behind your lines when you're engaged in a war against the Union, then you have to police those slaves. And so when we talked before about how 75% of the Confederate military-age young men had to be dedicated to the war effort, a chunk of that was on the battlefield, but also a chunk of that was left behind having to police the slaves, because slaves can rise up, slaves can run away, especially when slaves start hearing about things like the Emancipation Proclamation and all of that. Slaves know what's happening. Slaves know that this war is turning into a war over slavery over time. Slaves are going to bolt. And so Southerners have to leave behind a sizable population to police those slaves and prevent them from escaping, which is another disadvantage for Southerners. They have their effort is divided. You can't focus on just the war. You also have to focus on an unhappy internal population of people. So, Southerners disadvantaged in this way also. Talked before about railroads. This just kind of gives you a sense of how that played out. The vast majority of railroads, as you can see on this map over here, most of them are in the North. There are relatively few in the South compared to the North. And what that means is that Union forces can mobilize troops and supplies and move them from place to place much faster than Southerners can. Union forces can amass in, Boston, New York, whatever, and then they can relatively quickly, within a matter of hours or a couple of days, get all the way out into the Mississippi River area. Southerners, it's going to take a lot longer to get their troops from, South Carolina up to that Mississippi River Valley. So Southerners are going to be moving much slower than Northerners. Now, once Northerners get to, the battlefront and cross over into Southern territory, then, okay, that advantage is a bit moot. But in the initial disposition of troops, getting them from place to place, getting supplies there, the advantage is to the North because that's where all the railroads are. So, another Union advantage. This one, you don't want to place too much emphasis on it, but it is kind of an interesting little tidbit, is that white Northerners were much more literate and much better educated than white Southerners were. White Northerners were much quicker to embrace things like public education, compulsory education, learning how to read and write. Those types of things were much more valued in Northern states than they were in Southern states. And so this map is showing the lighter areas mean more literacy. The darker areas mean less literacy. And this is among whites. Obviously, if you were to include blacks, slaves, and free blacks, that would skew the numbers a bit. But this is white illiteracy, or literacy, whatever you want to call it. So, I don't know. Again, there's only so far you want to go with that, but this does indicate that Northerners were on average and on the whole better educated, probably a bit better, strategic thinkers, critical thinkers possibly, than Southerners were. And that can have an influence and a benefit on the battlefield. Another thing that's a little bit interesting to think about is that in the North, wealth was distributed much more evenly than it was in the South. In the South, I mean, we've been talking, we hear all the time about wealthy plantation owners and slave owners. And there was a small percentage of the Southern population that were wealthy slave-owning plantation owners. However, there weren't very many of them. I think in one of the books, it says the statistic is something like 1 in 10 Southerners actually owned slaves. And so what that means is that you have a few very wealthy plantation owners who are racking up all kinds of profits on cotton, tobacco, whatever it is they're selling. But at the same time, there's a whole lot of dirt poor white farmers out there in backwoods Mississippi or Alabama who have no wealth to their name at all. And so the income inequality in the South was very stark, very dramatic, as opposed to the North, which was much more, income inequality was much less of a problem at the North. Wealth was much more evenly distributed, as this map is showing. The orange and yellow areas are the greater concentrations of wealth, whereas in the South you can see that it's concentrated in certain, plantation areas along riverbanks and all of that, but there's not much outside of that. So there's a whole lot of poor backwoods farmers that aren't getting much from this. And so that can be an issue too. And so what's happening is that the Union is bringing in a whole lot of people into this war effort, supported by a whole lot of resources and a whole lot of wealth that Southerners do not have and Southerners cannot bring to the conflict. And so that can lead to things like, this is the relative military strengths of the Union and Confederate forces throughout the war. The Union had a much higher number of soldiers to throw at this war effort than did the Confederates. For all those reasons I just talked about, higher population, more resources, these people are better fed, these people are better clothed. The Union forces outmatch, are in much better fighting shape than the Confederate forces throughout the entire war. And at first, during the first years of the war, Union generals are going to be resistant to using these overwhelming numbers. You're going to read about George McClellan, who was a very good trainer of men and was very good at building and training an army, but he was very hesitant to use it. He became attached to his soldiers in a way that a lot of generals really say you shouldn't, because he became afraid to use them. So he kept building this massive army, making it bigger and bigger and better supplied and better fed and better trained. And he kept building this big, massive army, but he refused to commit it. It was only later when Ulysses S. Grant became head of the Union forces, the entire Union war effort, that at that point Union soldiers started getting used in numbers that started to turn the tide of the war. So, but there's one thing that we can notice here is that even with these small numbers of Confederate soldiers relative to Union soldiers, it is kind of amazing how well the Confederates did during the first years of the war. And part of that, again, is because of the resistance to using soldiers on the part of Union generals. But part of it was also the recognition by the Confederates that if we're going to win this thing, we have to do it quickly. Because the Confederates were totally aware of all of these discrepancies and advantages and disadvantages that I've been talking about here. The Confederates knew that the Union was going to be able to bring a whole lot of people at them, with a whole lot of money, with a whole lot of supplies, and so there's no way the Confederates are going to win this thing if it doesn't happen right away. If it gets drawn out, then the Confederates are going to lose. They know that. And that's exactly what happened, is that eventually the Union was just able to grind down the Confederacy to defeat. Okay, some of that is still to come, though. In this week, we're still just focusing on the first years of the war. One thing that, again, I kind of wanted to... This is where we left off last time, looking at kind of the map of the situation here. We've got 15 free states, those blue states up in the north there. We've got 11 slave states, the purple states, the Confederacy. And then we've got those 4 border states, the green states in the middle there. These are slave-holding states, as I mentioned before. These are slave-holding states that decided not to secede from the Union. And these are of huge symbolic importance to people like Abraham Lincoln, because the existence of these 4 states gives him evidence in saying that that this war is not a war over slavery. This war is to maintain the Union. It is not over slavery. Because if this was a war against slavery, these 4 states would leave. So Lincoln is able to use this as kind of a symbolic victory, or a symbolic explanation for his argument that the war is over Union, not slavery. Now in 1863, that's going to change. He's going to decide that with the Emancipation Proclamation that, okay, the calculus has changed, and now we're going to move this to become a war to emancipate slaves. But in the early years of the war, he's going to maintain the idea that this is for Union, and these 4 states are going to let him make that argument. Okay, now, so with all those advantages, and, you know, I mean, those 4 border states also gives just a tactical advantage, because that's more population that the Unions can use, more supplies and people for the Union forces and all of that. But, so how is this going to play out? I think this image might be in your book, or it even may be in Brightspace now that I think about it. But the original war plan for that Union soldiers came up with, Union generals came up with, was this snake plan. That whereas General Winfield Scott, who was the the guy in charge of the U.S. military as of 1861, came up with this plan where we're going to put this blockade around the South. As I mentioned before, block all the shipping and block all the smuggling, and try to block the smuggling and all of that. We're gonna act like an anaconda, where we're going to just wrap ourselves around the South, put it in a blockade so nothing comes in or out, and then we can see the head of the snake is starting to come down the Mississippi Valley, because the idea is that if we Northerners, the Unionists, can conquer the Mississippi Valley, that will sever the Confederacy in 2, and then we can squeeze. And that's basically the strategy that the Union's going to pursue throughout the entire war. Winfield Scott, he's going to be out of office within a matter of months after the war breaks out, just because he's about 150 years old. But everybody that comes after him is basically going to follow the same plan. And so, as we will see, in the next week or so, Ulysses S. Grant, with the Battle of Vicksburg and all of that, will achieve mastery over the Mississippi Valley, which does cut the Confederacy in half. And from that point on, it's just a matter of squeezing until the South's done. But we'll talk more about that in future weeks. I want to talk at first just about this initial conflict here, because the Union is able to mobilize all those advantages. But yet somehow, for the first year or 2 of the war, the Confederacy keeps winning. They keep winning all those early battles, to the frustration of Northerners. Again, part of it is resistance among Union generals to using all those forces, but another big factor in all of this, though, is the simple fact that the Confederacy is fighting a defensive war, whereas the Union is fighting an offensive war. Which means that the Union has to actually invade and conquer Confederate-held territory. So they have to go into unfriendly territory and subdue the people. That's difficult to do. The Confederates, on the other hand, they just have to sit and wait for the Union to come. The Confederacy, they get to dig in. They are on their home territory. They know where all of the advantageous attack points are. They know all the good escape routes. They know the lay of the land, and they know where to pick battles. And they are surrounded by friendly people who will supply them and help them in any way that they can. Union soldiers, on the other hand, have none of that. They don't know the territory. They're surrounded by hostile people. They're constantly getting hit by, Confederate ambushes and all of that. And so, all of that adds up to a whole bunch of Confederate victories in the early years of the war, because the Union is having to invade this hostile territory. Now, there is some value in the the officer class of the Confederate military. I mean, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, these are good generals. In some ways, they're not as great as they were later mythologized to be, but they're good generals, and so that they've got some good leadership. But they're also, again, fighting on home turf. That's psychologically advantageous because you're protecting your home from invaders and all of that. So basically, that's where we are at this point in the course, and this is the stuff that you're reading about in the textbook and in the other assigned readings for the course. During the first couple of years, the Confederacy is winning, even though all of the odds were stacked against them, which in some ways, which is why the Confederate war effort has kind of been mythologized, because despite all those odds, they still managed to pull out a whole bunch of victories in the first years of the war. But as I said before, the longer the war lasts, the more those northern advantages are going to just snowball into an unstoppable machine that the South is never going to be able to fight off. But anyway, that's stuff that is still to come. Take care, and I will talk to you next week.